The Egyptian vulture is the smallest vulture that breeds in Europe. It has a fairly broad distribution throughout southern Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. The birds in Europe are migratory. They migrate to Africa and winter in Africa. And Egyptian vultures are declining pretty much throughout their range in Asia, in Africa, and especially in Europe. Those declines are poorly understood and are likely a consequence of many, many different threats that operate simultaneously on breeding grounds, flyways, and wintering grounds. In the Balkans in particular, the population declines are quite severe, about 7% per year. And over the last 30 years, the populations on the Balkans have declined from more than 600 pairs in the 1980s to now less than 100 pairs. And in our two focal countries, in Bulgaria and Greece, is really only a handful left. The Bulgarians have about 20 pairs left, and in Greece there's 12 pairs left. So there's really not many Egyptian vultures left on the Balkan Peninsula. What I talked about earlier in September is that we found quite high juvenile mortality on migration. So we've tracked juvenile Egyptian vultures from the Balkan Peninsula along their migration into wintering areas and found that about 70% of all juveniles die within the first year. And half of those tracked birds died on migration simply because they took the wrong route and fell into the sea or got stranded on islands. So it wasn't a threat that they were being shot or poisoned, it was simply poor navigation. So that's a very disconcerting aspect and is certainly not conducive to have a stable population if 70% of your juveniles die within the first year. But that mortality of juveniles alone cannot explain the steep population decline that we're seeing. So there must be other factors at work that affect the adults or the productivity as well. So we need to understand those as well to help the population. Now, what could affect the populations on breeding grounds in Europe? Food shortage is a big issue for scavengers in Europe, especially since the outbreak of mad cow disease in 2002, which led the EU to regulate that farmers can't simply drop their dead cows and sheep into the fields anymore, which is what used to be done for decades. And for scavengers like vultures, dead animals in the field are a valuable food source. So now that we've noticed that this might lead to transmission of disease, the EU regulated that this is illegal, and so over vast stretches of southern Europe, all the dead cows and sheep had to be incinerated or brought to certain facilities. So they weren't available anymore in the wider landscape to serve as a food source for vultures. So that's a well-known problem that has affected vulture populations, especially on the Iberian Peninsula. And because Greece has been a founding member of the EU, the same regulations apply in Greece. Bulgaria only joined the EU in 2007, so this is more of a recent phenomenon. But generally, this could operate in those two countries as well. So it's a potential reason for declining populations. There are lots of land use changes and industrial infrastructure that might affect populations on breeding grounds, so especially electrical infrastructure, aging electrical infrastructure that poses an electrocution risk to birds on breeding grounds, and also new infrastructure such as wind turbines that can affect vultures by simply killing them. And research in Spain has shown that you don't need to kill a lot of adult vultures by wind turbines to cause population decline. So a few dead birds here and there might be sufficient to cause population declines. And another potential cause is accidental poisoning and direct persecution, which is quite widespread in southern Europe and especially in Greece. The poisoning is mostly because many landowners and farmers or hunters are worried that wolves or foxes or dogs or bears steal their chickens or their sheep, and so there not being any adequate compensation measures by the government, they go out and put poison in the landscape to kill the foxes or the wolves or the bears so they don't steal their chickens. And the vultures will then eat either the bait or the dead fox and get poisoned accidentally. It's not the intention of the farmer or landowner to poison the vulture, but they suffer from it. And there's also direct persecution. People shoot adult vultures, collect their eggs for taxidermy or other collection purposes, and especially in Bulgaria, they've had numerous incidences with individuals collecting raptor eggs and adults. So these are all threats that we know operate on breeding grounds, but we don't know to what extent they actually affect the population. In this LIFE project, which has been running in those two countries, in Bulgaria and Greece, since 2010, we're working with BirdLife partners, the Bulgarian Society for the Protection of Birds, HOS and WWF in Greece. And we've tried to figure out what are the main problems for Egyptian vultures on their breeding grounds and what can we do to save them. And today I'm going to talk about three main issues. The first one is whether the diet of Egyptian vultures on breeding grounds is related to their productivity and to their territory occupancy. So do birds that have a broader or a narrow diet have a better breeding success and maintain their territories for longer, or is there absolutely no relationship with diet? The second is what other landscape variables, like the proportion of agricultural fields or roads or mines or other things that you can find in the landscape, can they explain whether the birds have a higher or lower breeding success or abandon their territories? And finally, we wanted to know whether the current conservation management that our partners are conducting, whether that is actually effective in increasing the productivity of Egyptian vultures and the survival of adults during the breeding season. So I will start with the measurements of diet. For that, we use the remains that are found in Egyptian vulture nests. So Egyptian vultures nest in caves, and they bring all sorts of stuff to their nest to feed the chicks. So at the end of the season, you can find lots of bones and feathers and other remnants that they don't eat in the nests, and we collected that from 143 breeding attempts in 51 territories. And it usually comes as a pile of bones and feathers. We gave that to people in the Bulgarian Natural History Museum, and they sorted it all out. So all the remains were identified at least to taxonomic order, many of them also to species level. And from that, we calculated a diet diversity index, so how many different species and how many different parts of each species a given pair had consumed and left at the nest. And we then related this metric of dietary diversity to productivity, so how many chicks the pair raised, and to territory occupancy, so how frequently a territory was occupied over a number of years. And this is a rough representation of the diet composition of Egyptian vultures. Egyptian vultures are incredibly flexible in what they eat. We found 138 different species in their remnants in their nests. So they eat pretty much anything they can gather in the landscape. And these are just the most common things. So on the left, you have tortoises that made up about 30% of the nest remains in the Eastern Europe, southern Bulgaria, and in central Greece. The second most component were livestock, sheep, cows, goats, followed by dogs, wolves, foxes, and chickens. What you need to keep in mind is that we infer this diet. So on the y-axis is a proportion of remnants that come from these different taxonomic orders. That's all inferred from what is left at the nest. So that's not necessarily the proportion what the birds eat, because some things that the birds eat don't leave anything at the nest. So if you imagine that there's a dead cow in the field, and the vulture goes there and rips out the guts and the eyeballs and eats all of that, there's nothing left at the nest, so we can't track that. And the reason why tortoises are so prominent in this measure of diet is that they have a nice shell, and the vultures don't eat that shell, and the shell is always left at the nest. So you'll always have a very high proportion of tortoises when you measure the diet like that. But that's still valid to compare diet diversity across regions and different nests. And so what you can see from here is that tortoises and livestock are much less common in northern Bulgaria, which is quite normal because northern Bulgaria is cooler and there's simply fewer tortoises available in the landscape, so the vultures have fewer tortoises to eat, and they seem to compensate for that by eating carnivores and chickens. And the carnivores are always dead things that are run over on the road or otherwise died somewhere in the landscape, because the Egyptian vultures, they don't kill things, they mostly gather dead things. Now, if we look at changes of diet composition over time to see whether there's been any recent changes in what the birds eat, especially in Bulgaria, since Bulgaria joined the EU in 2007, we see that there's a lot of variability. There seems to be a slightly declining trend in the proportion of tortoises in the diet and a marginal increase in livestock in the diet, but no real trends for the other major orders. So there isn't really an obvious signal that the birds have lost a major food component over time. And if we look at the relationship between diet and productivity, there's absolutely no relationship at all. So whether the birds have a very narrow diet or a very broad diet, it makes no difference as to the number of fledglings they produce. So this graph shows you the average number of fledglings on the y-axis and the diversity index on the x-axis, and you can see that across the board there's a lot of variation, and there's really no trend that birds with a broad or narrow diet produce more fledglings. So no effect of diet on productivity, but we did find an effect of diet on the territory occupancy. So this graph shows you the proportion of years a territory is occupied by adult Egyptian vultures on the y-axis. So 1 means it's occupied in every year, and 0.2 means it's only occupied in 1 out of 5 years. And the dietary diversity index. And the graph that is fitted by a model tells you that territories that have either a very broad diet or a very narrow diet tend to have a lower occupancy rate. And biologically, you can think of that. If in the landscape there is not enough of the preferred diet available, the birds either have to forage around and eat quite a lot of different things, which leads to a very high diversity of diet, because they have to pick up things that they wouldn't otherwise eat if they had enough dead cows or dead sheep available, or they simply cannot find enough food, so they have a very narrow diet because they can only eat a certain narrow spectrum of what is locally available. And both those patterns might indicate that there's simply not enough preferred diet available, and the birds might then abandon those territories, or, and that's the worst case scenario, by virtue of not having sufficient natural diet available, the birds might be tempted or might be more vulnerable to eating poisoned carcasses. So carcasses that were poisoned by landowners to kill livestock predators, they might be more preferably consumed when there isn't a lot of natural diet available, so that these birds die, and the lower territory occupancy actually results from adult birds dying as a result of consuming poison carcasses. We don't know whether that is the effect. We can only look at the occupancy rate, and we don't know why territories were abandoned, whether the birds died or went somewhere else. But judging from the population decline, it's quite unlikely that the birds simply went somewhere else, at least not in the Balkan Peninsula. So, from the diet study, we can conclude that it's quite unlikely that dietary limitations affect the productivity of Egyptian vultures, but there might be an effect of diet and the availability of a balanced diet in the landscape to affect territory retention and adult survival, and that would be quite important for managing the population. So, not having a very strong effect of diet, we then wondered what other factors in the landscape might affect productivity and occupancy rate. So our partners went around the landscape and measured 46 nest-specific and landscape variables on the ground or via remote sensing, such as the number of power pylons and how high the cliffs are. We went around and asked the livestock farmers how many cows and chickens they had. We asked the hunters how much wild deer and wild boar is available in the landscape, to get lots of variables that might affect the productivity or the occupancy of Egyptian vultures. We then related the occupancy, so whether a territory is occupied or not, or the productivity, so the number of fledglings pair produces, which is 0, 1, or 2, to all these variables in a complicated machine learning model that can simultaneously evaluate all these different variables, and then uses a permutation-based metric to rank which of those variables are most important in explaining the variation in productivity and occupancy. And what we get out of that is a graph that shows us which of the variables are important. So this is the variable importance for the territory occupancy. The model was fairly good and was able to classify about 85% of the territories accurately. So it could accurately predict whether a territory was occupied or not. But it required quite a lot of different variables to do this classification. And so the variable importance is scaled. It's usually measured by some obtuse index of predictive performance loss, but you can scale it to 100%, so the top variable is 100% and everything else is relative to that. And you can see that there's quite a lot of variables that have some influence on the occupancy, with the most important being the proportion of agricultural fields within a 5-kilometer radius around the nest, and the second most being the number of food sources. So this is very informative, and it tells us, okay, there's quite a few different variables that might affect whether Egyptian vultures occupy a territory or not. But when we look at the effect size of those variables, and I just picked the top 4 variables, you can see that the effect size is actually quite small. So the top left graph, this is the most important variable. This is the proportion of agricultural fields within a 5-kilometer radius. And you can see that from having absolutely no agriculture, 0, to having everything in agriculture, it only changes the predicted proportion of occupied territories from 0.75 to 0.9. So it's not a lot of difference if you change this variable from 0 to 100. The same for the number of reliable food sources. Adding 5 or 6 reliable food sources, and these are abattoirs, rubbish dumps, slaughterhouses where you have lots and lots of food that's constantly available. It doesn't really change the magnitude, the proportion of occupied territories by a great margin. So we have lots and lots of variables that affect the occupancy, but not a single variable has a very strong effect on occupancy. So the next thing is we did the same for productivity. The productivity model is slightly more complicated because you have not just two categories, presence or absence. You have three categories because they can have either one or two chicks. So the model wasn't quite as good, but it was still reasonably accurate in correctly predicting 72% of the breeding attempts. And again, we see the same pattern. We have lots and lots of different variables that factor into this model to arrive at this predictive success, with the most important being the distance to the food source, and the second most important being the length of paved roads within a 5-kilometer radius around the nest. Now you might think, oh, that's very suspicious, obtuse modeling that he's doing there. Surely it's only presenting some crap that has no biological meaning whatsoever. But the length of paved roads is actually a useful mechanism because Egyptian vultures pick up a lot of food on paved roads, because on paved roads things get run over, and they obviously get run over the faster cars drive. The cars drive faster on paved roads, so the length of paved roads might actually be a useful index of how much food is available in the landscape for Egyptian vultures. So if we look at the effect sizes of those top 4 variables, we see that it all makes sense. The further you are away from a food source, the lower is the predicted number of fledglings that are produced. Obviously, if you have to fly further to get your food, then you can deliver less to your chicks. With the paved roads, as I mentioned, the more paved roads you have more run over animals, so again, more food. But as for the occupancy before, the effect size is very, very small. So for each of those variables, changing it from one end to the other really only makes a very, very small difference to the productivity of Egyptian vultures. So in conclusion, for this whole landscape analysis, we find many different factors that affect occupancy and productivity. But the marginal effect of each of those variables is very, very small. And that is very, very challenging for management. So you cannot walk away from this analysis and say, oh great, we can just change the landscape from all agriculture to all farmland, and it will make a huge difference. You would have to simultaneously manage 20 to 30 different aspects of the landscape to get a significant effect in terms of productivity or occupancy. And that makes it a very, very complex thing to do in practice. Now, the fact that management is extremely complex doesn't stop our partners from doing it. So since 2003, there has been conservation management in place specifically to help Egyptian vultures. And it started by establishing vulture restaurants. So these are dedicated feeding stations where you put a dead cow every 2 days so that the vultures have a reliable source of food and they can go there and get their fill. Since 2009, the Bulgarians especially also started nest guarding, where they put volunteers next to the nests pretty much throughout the entire breeding season, with the intention to deter nest robbers, to prevent disturbance to the nest, and also to pick up chicks that accidentally fall out of the nest cave and would otherwise die on the ground. And since 2010, in the course of this LIFE project, we also started individual supplementary feeding. So instead of having a central vulture restaurant where you have a centralized place and you dump tons of food there, you provide smaller parcels of food to vultures very close to their nests. And the hope is that because Egyptian vultures are the smallest of the 4 vulture species in Europe, they often suffer from interspecific competition at those larger restaurants, so they get displaced by other species. But if you give them sort of handfuls of food directly at their nest, they should be able to take this up better than having these larger feeding stations. So we tried that since 2010 to see whether it has an effect. Now, all this management was done mostly by pragmatic conservation enthusiasts without much scientific design. So the guarding was applied in areas where they thought that taxidermy collectors were operating, and the feeding was conducted in areas where they historically thought the birds are doing very poorly and there might not be enough food. So there was no scientific design in the management. We didn't set this up and say, okay, we're going to feed and guard these pairs and compare them to those pairs where we don't apply this management, which makes the whole thing slightly more complicated to analyze. So what we did is we used all the territories that in which some management was applied in any of the past 10 years, and simply compared the performance before and after management within those same territories. So that controls for spatial differences in breeding performance or occupancy, and gets us around the problem that this wasn't properly scientifically designed from the start. Another problem is that the management is partly confounded, so we cannot separate the effects of individual supplementary feeding and nest guarding because they always occur together. So every territory that received supplementary food was also guarded by a volunteer. So we can't necessarily separate the effects of those two management actions. So what we did, we built a bunch of GLMMs to relate the number of fledged young to various management variables to see which of those variables would best explain the variation in Egyptian vulture productivity. Some highlights from the management. So over the last 5 or 6 years, there were 42,000 hours of voluntary nest guarding, and during this rather large amount of effort, they prevented 4 fatal nest disturbances. So where they knew, okay, somebody is approaching the nest and they're going to destroy it, and the volunteer nest guards stopped that. Also, during the same period, they rescued 8 chicks that had naturally fallen out of the nest for whatever reason, and these chicks were picked up and rehabilitated and then sent on their way. And we provided a total amount of 21.6 tons of supplementary food to the vultures in those territories. The overall effect of all of this hard work was very marginal. This is a simple summary of the overall data. Here are the territories in years where there was no management. The center pair of points is for territories where there was only nest guarding, and the third pair of points is for those that received supplementary food and nest guarding. The red dots are for territories that were within 10 kilometers of a vulture restaurant, so that's an easy stroll for an Egyptian vulture to fly there and pick up some food. And the green ones are in areas where there was no vulture restaurant. And you can see that for the green dots, there's absolutely no difference between those 3 management actions. There seemed to be slightly higher productivity for territories that received nest guarding and were within a vulture restaurant, but the effect is very, very small. So if we do a whole load of modeling, we get out a bunch of estimated effect sizes, which are all very discouraging. So each of those graphs shows you the predicted effect on Egyptian vulture productivity and the number of fledglings per breeding pair over either the number of guarding days per nest, whether a vulture feeding station is there, the total guarding effort, or the number of days when food is provided. And you can see, okay, we can put in 2,500 hours of guarding effort, and that will increase the number of fledglings by 0.1. So it's really not very efficient to do that. And yeah, it's rather disillusioning. You can put in all this effort, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be terribly effective. So all this management doesn't really help with productivity, but for a species like Egyptian vultures, adult survival is much, much more influential for population trajectories than productivity, simply because they're long-lived, and losing an adult bird has a much stronger effect on the population than losing one or two chicks. So we wanted to know whether this management might have a positive effect on adult survival. The two main mechanisms how this might work is that feeding might reduce poison consumption. As I mentioned with the diet before, if the birds simply have to forage around for their food and there's not enough natural diet available in the territories, they might be at higher risk to find a poison carcass, eat a poison carcass and die. So if you clobber the birds with supplementary food, which is safe to eat, and you give them tons of food near the nest, they will happily eat that with no need to forage around and potentially pick up a poison carcass. So you could reduce adult mortality by providing sufficient safe food near the nest. Nest guarding might prevent taxidermy. So if you have guards near the nest, you might deter people who might come and want to shoot the adult Egyptian vultures to stick them on a mount somewhere. And so there is reason to believe that all this management might actually have a positive effect on adult survival. But how do we assess management effects on survival? And that comes to a very, very tricky statistical problem, because usually when we estimate the survival of wild bird species, we mark them in one way or another. We put rings on them or tags, or they have natural markings, so that we can follow individual birds over time and we can assess whether they survive or die. The adult Egyptian vultures that we're working with here, they're all unmarked. We can't catch them, we can't put any rings on them, so you can't uniquely identify them. They're not sexually dimorphic, so you go into a territory, if you see two birds, then you know you've seen the male and the female. If you only see one bird, you don't know whether it was the male or the female, so you can't track them in that way. And they're also frequently very far away from the nest. They fly easily 30 kilometers away from the nest to find food. So on any given day, when you go to a territory, you only have about a 30% chance of seeing the birds that are actually nesting there. So it's very, very difficult to just go there and observe birds and say, oh, this bird has died, because usually you don't see both birds anyway. So that's a quite complex problem that other people have encountered before us. So 5 years ago, there's two Swiss ornithologists that proposed a model to estimate individual survival from unmarked animals by using a dynamic occupancy modeling framework. So it's essentially a series of 0 and 1 data, where you just list whether you've seen a bird or you haven't seen a bird, and from that you try to estimate the detection probability, and based on the detection probability you then try to estimate the survival. This was done for nightingales, I think, so for territorial birds where you usually only detect one of the partners, a singing male, whereas in our case we have two birds that can be detected because you detect them visually and you can see the male and the female roughly in the same proportion. So there's an extension to this in a binomial mixture modeling framework with 2 adults. So it slightly changes the distribution from having 0, 1 data to having actual counts of 0, 1, or 2 birds, which is described in some obscure biometrics paper. And so you have all this valuable statistical literature that tells you how to do it, but then actually doing it in practice is another matter entirely. So we assembled the data on the daily observations that we had from nest guarding efforts and from all the surveys of our partners for 23 weeks over the breeding season. So we had data from 154 territories for which we had enough daily observations to estimate weekly survival over the breeding season. And then I tried to ask a statistician for help. Adam, our staff statistician, is always very helpful when you have questions like that, and he sends back very helpful emails that are essentially coded in Greek and give you something to do for a week. But Adam was very helpful to help me construct a Bayesian model to estimate survival that would include informative priors. So we know in advance that adult survival over 1 week is very, very high. So we would expect adults to have an annual survival probability of more than 80 to 85%. So within a given week during the breeding season, the survival needs to be very, very high. And so we can feed that in to a Bayesian modeling framework, and that was fairly successful. The problem with the Bayesian approach is that there isn't any guidance how to select between different models. So we have all these different potential management strategies, nest guarding, Vulture restaurants, individual supplementary feeding, and we don't know which one works or doesn't work. And the standard multi-model inference model selection strategies that are available in the frequentist framework, they're less well established in the Bayesian framework. So I also tried another road, which is an R package called unmarked for the analysis of unmarked animals, which has a function called pCountOpen, which implements the Dial-Emerson model and can be manipulated to estimate survival. I've only printed the code of this function down here to... Okay. You got bored. Okay, great. So you don't have to look into this code in detail. It's basically an equation that lists the various components of this model, the survival, the colonization, and then we're interested in the survival in relation to management and the probability of detection. Now the tricky thing about this model is you have to specify an upper limit for the integration for the abundance estimate, which is this parameter k. And there's lots of guidance available on how you should set that. From a statistical perspective, you want to set this number so high that it doesn't affect the likelihood integration. So you would set it to a number of 20 by default. But this refers to the number of birds that you're estimating in the territory. So we're dealing with 2 territorial adults, so we know that there can't be more than 2 birds in that territory. So biologically, it makes no sense to set this number to 20. So there's a discrepancy between what is statistically sensible and what is biologically sensible. And the only reason I'm telling you that is because it makes a huge difference on what we actually estimate. And I'll get to that in a second. So these are the effects estimated from the Bayesian model on adult survival. And basically, this is a posterior distribution of the parameter estimate, and you read that on the x-axis is a parameter estimate, and on the y-axis the frequency of posterior estimates. So basically, the zero that is indicated by the red dotted line means there is absolutely no effect. So if you want to find a strong effect, you want that histogram to be as far away from the zero as possible. And you can see that pretty much every histogram completely overlaps that red line, which means there is no effect on the food amount, the guarding days, the feeding days, the net guarding or the feeding. So it's really not telling us that any of these management techniques have a very strong effect on adult survival. If we do this in the frequentist framework, we get quite different answers. This shows you the probability of losing a territorial adult bird depending on 4 different management techniques for a sensible, biologically sensible number of maximum birds. And you can see that this effect here between losing 10% and losing 5% of territorial adults is actually quite a large biological effect. If you set this to a statistically recommended threshold, the effect gets even larger. And so if we would base our inference on this type of approach, we would actually conclude that nest guarding and supplementary feeding would have a huge effect on adult survival, because reducing the probability of losing a territorial adult during the breeding season from 15% to 7%, that's a massive reduction. So that would be a huge biological effect, but the evidence for that is rather weak. So that leaves us, and me particularly, in a very difficult situation. We get to slightly different conclusions based on what approach we're using, which is never very encouraging. We also estimate very similar effect sizes for 2 completely different biological mechanisms. So the effect size for nest guarding and supplementary feeding is very similar, but nest guarding will never prevent an Egyptian vulture from feeding on a poison carcass. And supplementary feeding will never prevent somebody from shooting an Egyptian vulture. So they're completely different mechanisms how you would reduce the survival. And I would never expect them to be exactly of the same magnitude. So that makes me very suspicious that something is going on here that I don't really trust. So my conclusion now, and I'm very happy if any of you has a different conclusion, is that with the current data set, we simply cannot distinguish with any certainty whether there is no biological effect of this management, or whether we simply don't have the statistical power to detect this effect because the sample size is too small. So the solution would be to enter data. The data that we've used for this modeling is only from about 1/3 of the monitored territories. There's lots more data available that exists in scribbled Bulgarian notebooks, which are not available to me for analysis. So that would be a first step to make those available in digital form so I could actually use them. And another solution would be that we use the remaining project years, this summer and next summer, to increase the power. So collect data in a sensible fashion to, for example, separate the effects of nest guarding and supplementary feeding. But that is not always very popular on the ground because there's some pragmatic limitations that we have to work with. So if we summarize the management effectiveness, there's absolutely no evidence that nest guarding and supplementary feeding increase the breeding success. So in terms of increasing the breeding success, this management doesn't seem to have the desired effect. There might be quite a strong effect on adult survival, but we currently don't have sufficient evidence, so we might need some more data, or if we do collect more data, it might actually tell us that it isn't efficient for increasing adult survival as well. However, none of the management appears to have a negative effect, so it's good. We didn't find a lower productivity or higher mortality with more feeding or guarding. So whatever is being done on the ground isn't making things worse, apart from spending lots of money and time. So the question is it better than doing nothing at all? It's not efficient, but it might still be better than doing nothing at all. So, in summary, Egyptian vultures are going extinct on the Balkan Peninsula, which is a sad thing. And despite 10 years of management, the population decline hasn't really slowed down. So, from that perspective, the management is either insufficient or ineffective, but it's not really working. We have a set of very enthusiastic local partners who do a lot of work to implement the management, to monitor these populations, but they do need our scientific input to make sense of the data that they collect and to guide their enthusiasm what to implement on the ground and how to make this more efficient. We also have similar partners in other areas where Egyptian vultures breed, especially in Turkey and in Central Asia, where we know absolutely nothing about the species. We don't even know whether they're declining or not. We don't know what threats exist. It's quite possible that the species might be in a lot of trouble, but we simply don't know. And it would be very good to work with these partners and establish what can be done and work in populations where we have larger sample sizes and not just 10 territories in the whole country. And the RSPB could make a huge difference by working with these partners on the species in areas such as Turkey and Central Asia to figure out whether the species is declining and what we can do to save it before it's too late. So it would be a shame if we were to walk away from the species because it doesn't fit in a new strategy. And with that, I'd like to thank all our partners, which is a lot of people in Bulgaria and Greece, and a single lone figure in Macedonia. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask me the question. I will repeat that for the benefit of the people who listen to this in a recorded version or in the VC.
Thank you very much, Steffen. I think we'll go to the VC folk first. I'll put a light on in here as well so we can see each other just for now. So Aberdeen, have you got any questions for Steffen?
No, nothing from here.
Okay, thank you. So over to you guys in the lodge if there's any questions. Do you want to go first?
You were suspicious about the results being very similar to two different mechanisms of trade, but you knew that they were threats. The anecdotal evidence about the losses due to poisoning or due to shooting, were they of a similar order that might give you a bit more confidence that the model was predicting something that was sensible?
So the question is whether there is anecdotal evidence about the magnitude of the poisoning and the shooting to have sort of a similar effect on adult survival. And there isn't that much anecdotal evidence. The problem is that especially the magnitude of the poisoning is extremely difficult to assess because very rarely do you find poisoned adults. So over the last 15 years, they've picked up 13 adult individuals in Greece, but the number of birds that are actually poisoned and then disappear somewhere in the landscape without anybody finding them is completely unknown. So it's very, very difficult to say how large this effect could be. So it's really difficult to say whether shooting or poisoning is more important, and it probably varies regionally as well.
Any more questions here? Yeah.
Can you monitor carcasses and stuff? So could you kind of transit across landscapes and monitor whether carcasses are actually being poisoned, and use that as a kind of index of the potential for poisoning? Because obviously, I presume you can't track birds because it's too expensive to put tags and things on them. But is there another way of a kind of index you can use?
So the question is whether we could use some index of poisoning by doing transit counts of carcasses and then analyzing them, whether they've been poisoned or not. In theory, yes, I think that's possible, but it would be an enormous effort I think the length of transits that you would have to run to find a reasonable number of carcasses would be enormous. So we've tried to figure out the number or the proportion of the population that is engaging in these activities by conducting undercover interviews. So talking to hunters, talking to livestock owners to ask who uses poison in the landscape, and there's quite large differences. So it's much more prevalent in Greece than in Bulgaria, but quantifying that on a landscape scale for all the territories, it would be extremely challenging, especially because the poisoning isn't something that is consistently higher in one area over the other. The poisoning is basically comes in pulses. So when a farmer loses 5 chickens and he goes out and poisons a whole lot, but if he hasn't lost any chickens in 2 years, then he might be less inclined to put out a lot of poison. So in theory, yes, it would be possible, but in practice, I think the amount of effort that you would have to put in to get a sensible level of variation would be enormous. So I don't see how it would be practically feasible.
The big question you didn't touch on really is how important survival in their wintering sites. As you said, for juveniles, it's a big problem. Is it insignificant for the adults?
The question is whether survival on the wintering grounds may not be more important than on the breeding grounds. That's perfectly valid. And currently we don't know whether adult mortality is more prominent on breeding grounds or on the flyway or in wintering grounds. We try to address that this year by tagging adult birds with satellite transmitters so we can get similar information as to what we have for juveniles for adult birds. The reason why we've tried to focus on breeding grounds here is that we can actually implement management on breeding grounds. So these birds migrate through 25 different countries on their way to wintering grounds, and even identifying sources of mortality like poisoning or shooting or electrocution, which we all know happen along the flyway and in wintering areas, is very, very difficult to address in 20 different countries across Northern Africa and the Middle East. So if we can find something that we can actually tackle on breeding grounds that works, that would be preferable. But failing that, we may have to go and see whether there is anything that we can solve on the flyway or in wintering areas. And we're working on that, but it's just much, much more complicated to implement management over the geographic scales that are involved in wintering areas and flyway.
Yes, but just for example, there was that electric
power line in Sudan.
Yes. Which was known to be very bad. And yet electrification has taken place all over Africa. There are some in really probably key areas like around the Lake Turkana Basin. And that is where, when these developments are taking place now and in the very near future, that is where there might be some ability to change what happens, you know, through funding mechanisms and even policy at government levels. But without knowing anything about it, is very difficult to know what to say and what to do.
Yeah, it is very difficult, and we're trying to address that. So we want to track more adults to find out whether there is significant mortality, and there is also the plan to have a flyway action plan workshop this summer to get representatives of all the governments from the flyway involved and promote things like the refurbishment of the power line in Sudan. And the hope is that if you tell people in Saudi Arabia that even in Sudan they are able to retrofit the power line, that they might be inclined to do that for their aging infrastructure as well.
It follows on really, just to ask, is you're talking about the Eastern European breeding population, are they completely distinct from the Western European, and do the Western European population migrate to West Africa? And is anyone looking at similar breeding issues on?
Yeah, so the question is whether the Eastern European breeding population of Egyptian vultures is distinct from the Western population. So there is a large population on the Iberian Peninsula, which is much larger than in Eastern Europe, and there is a very, very small remnant population in southern Italy, and they all seem to be separated. So all the eastern birds migrate around the eastern margin of the Mediterranean. All the birds from the Iberian Peninsula migrate across Gibraltar and winter in the western part of northern Africa. There's a very large academic community in Spain working with Egyptian vultures on breeding grounds and on wintering grounds, and their populations don't seem to be declining as rapidly as in Eastern Europe. So whatever threats they're exposed to, they are not as severe as in Eastern Europe. But many of the threats are the same. Poisoning, electrocution occurs in Spain as well, and in Western Africa.
But for vultures generally, one of the interesting things that's coming out is that within Africa, the threats are quite different. So in West Africa, there's a threat from Juju and Muti and vulture parks in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Whereas Eastern and Southern
that affects the population in Eastern Europe as well, because some of our birds winter in Niger and Nigeria, and the people who sell vulture parts on markets in Nigeria, they now travel into other countries to get the vulture parts. So we had one of our satellite tracked birds shot in Niger by a person who then drove with the intact transmitter to a market in Nigeria.
You sell that as well.
So we know that the market trade in Nigeria might be a big problem, but it's very, very difficult to assess the magnitude of all these different threats on the population.
Okay, I think we might have to call it a day there since we've reached our 2 o'clock cut-off. But thank you very much, Steffen, for a fascinating talk. Thank you, all of you, for your questions. And I'm sure if anyone does have any other points they want to discuss with Steffen, I'm sure he'll be happy for you to come and catch him afterwards. So thank you very much.